Hello everyone! If you don't know anything about trading, candlestick structures or patterns, please don't worry. I'm here to teach you from A to Z about candlestick charts and patterns. This series will be a YouTube playlist to teach you how to trade candlestick patterns. And this is our intro session video where you learn the structure of candlesticks. Later on in my YouTube playlist, I'll go over each candlestick patterns. Before I start, how are you? How is your trading life? Or why have you started to trade? Please let me know in the comment section below. Now let's get started. This is the daily candlestick chart of the Apple stock. It may look confusing to beginners with all colors and weird shapes. However, believe me, it's extremely simple to read and understand. What you see on the screen is part of 1 year, 1 day time frame. So I couldn't get the whole chart here in the slide, but the idea is this represents a 1 year time frame and every single candlestick represents a day in the stock market in this chart. This is quite simple actually. The green candles mean that the closing price of the day is higher than the opening price of that day. For example, the market opens and Apple is around $150 and the closing price of the that day is 160 for Apple. And as a result, our candle is green. Red candles indicate the exact opposite of green candles. The closing price for that day is lower than the opening price. I think that we made a sweet intro into candlesticks. Now, let's dive deeper to understand individual candlestick structures. Let's check out how a green candlestick shape comes into existence. The stock market opens and all the stocks in the market start with a price, depending on their sell and buy orders. In our example, Apple starts around $150 early in the morning. 1 hour later, the price drops to $145 and the candle is red at the moment because the current price is lower than the opening price of the stock. However, 4 hours later, big news comes up to Apple stock and the price jumps to $170. Now our candle is green due to the current price is higher than the opening price. Finally, the market is about to close and people decide to take some profits. Then the price drops from 170 to 165 when the market closes. When we see green candles like this one, we generally assume it as a bullish price action because buyers beat sellers and take control of this time session. We'll talk about this later on. This is the lifespan of a single candlestick. This example is based on 1 day time interval. However, this candlestick could have been presenting 1 hour or 1 minute, all the same. Now, let's check out a red candle life cycle. Red candles have no difference from green candles, except the meaning that they give to the traders. In this example, Apple starts the day around $170 when the market opens. 1 hour later, buyers step in and push the price to 175. However, 4 hours later, an earnings report came that was worse than expected, and the price suddenly dropped to 150. Finally, the market is about to close, and some buyers think that 150 is a really cheap price for Apple and buy some shares. Then the stock closes the day at 155. This is the full lifespan of a daily candlestick of Apple stock in the market. When we see red candles like this one, it indicates a bearish price action. We generally call it as sellers take control of the stock. However, Candlesticks alone are not useful. There are so many other important elements to trading, such as volume, trend channels, support and resistance, formations. You have to make strong decisions, considering many different elements at the same time. I'll teach you every one of these in details in my channel for free. Please stay tuned. Now you get the basics of candlestick structures. Let's learn what's called what and some other definitions. As you learned, there are two types of candles, red and green. Green candles represent bullish movement in the price and red ones bearish movement. These candles between open and close prices are called body of the candlestick. These thin sticks at the top and bottom of the candle have many different names. Some people call them the shadow of the candle, some others say tail or wick. These simply show the highest and the lowest point of the price that reached during that time interval. For example, the highest of the day could be $200 and the lowest 100. Open and close prices are always between these numbers. So, this is the TradingView website, one of the most popular charting platforms in the world. It's extremely useful and easy to use. Now, these are time intervals. If I click the time D, it represents 1 day in the market. As you can see on the chart, each candlestick reflects a 1 day, and you can see the date at the bottom as I move the mouse. Let's click 1H. Now each candlestick represents 1 hour in time. Check the time of the day at the bottom. There are so many time interval options. Which time interval you use depends on what kind of trader you are. A day trader, a swing trader, or a long-term investor. I'll teach you about time intervals and which one you should use in much more detail in other videos. And you already know how to read candlesticks. Every trading website and software have special OHCL data, which simply shows open, high, close, and low prices. Just hover over a candle and you can see them right here. Great, I think we are moving on really well, covering almost everything. Now, let's talk about why in the world we use candlesticks charts for. First of all, it helps traders have a glimpse of the future based on past patterns. This helps us make decisions if financial security will be bullish or bearish in the next candle. Secondly, candlesticks are extremely helpful to identify our entry, exit, or take profit points and the stop loss points. I especially use bullish and bearish engulfing patterns while I'm trading, and these patterns help me to place my stop loss orders. As you know, we are in the technology era, and algorithmic trading is quite popular. Autobots, AI, semi-auto trading software are everywhere. However, have you ever thought about how these programs decide to buy or sell? They are just like us. They are programmed to identify candlesticks, patterns, formations, trends, and so on. This is how they make decisions. They are basically traders like you, but millions of times quicker and able to process data in seconds. Finally, candlesticks are a great source to understand the feelings and emotions of the market. Yes, the market. Because the market is like a living organism. Actually, it's a living organism, made of millions of people and their decisions. Each bearish and bullish momentum represents a psychological reaction to an event. Candlesticks help us to evaluate the psychological conditions of the market. I think right now you gained extremely useful information about candlesticks. Let's move on. This video is the introduction to how to trade candlestick patterns. Please check my YouTube playlist called How to Trade Candlestick Patterns. I'm going over each candlestick pattern one by one. I'm teaching the structure of the pattern, the meaning of the pattern, how to enter, exit, take profits, and use stop-loss orders, providing many live examples from TradingView website and Thinkorswim software. This rating table is not something like an official document or something. Every single trader in the world is unique and different. Every one of them has different methods and strategies. One thing works well for me may not work for you. This table reflects my trading experience in the last 10 years. I heavily use the first 6 candlestick patterns and much less the others. However, there could be a trader out there that only uses morning star or dark cloud cover patterns. I'll go over each of these patterns in my How to Trade Candlestick Patterns YouTube playlist. Please check that out if you are interested in learning about candlestick patterns. Okay guys, this was our intro session on how to trade candlestick patterns. I wanted to teach you the basics and the structure of the candlesticks. In our next video, we'll start to learn candlestick patterns one by one. The structure of the pattern, the meaning of the pattern, how to enter, exit, take profits, and use stop-loss orders, providing many live examples from TradingView and Thinkorswim software. I hope you liked the video, and I'll be really glad if you learned anything from my experiences. Please like and subscribe to the channel and help me to grow it. Thank you all of you, and see you later.